Hello and good afternoon. How's everybody doing?
Oh, good. This is Mark.
Mark, I got to tell you.
I didn't know if I called the right number.
Oh, you definitely got the right number. And boy, you've got the right number when it comes to telling the story of somebody that the world can never forget. Isaac Hayes, sir.
Isn't it amazing?
It is. Why did we
Isn't
have...
it amazing? I mean, most people would say like in a second Shaft, right? But there's so much more. I mean, there's so much more to it than that. And it's like a parable of the music industry, just living his life, reliving his life.
Well,
It's fascinating. He's fascinating. I finished a book on Bill Withers.
Oh.
And there are parallels between like the soul artists from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
They're like all tethered together. It's amazing how many similarities there are. And but Isaac was the king. You know,
he was. It's almost like it's music's secret, and it's like I don't want it to be a secret. I've been in radio for 43 years, and Isaac Hayes was such a big part of that career. But I want the new generation to know who Isaac Hayes is.
Yeah, except when Shaft comes on,
Yeah.
You know, the satellite or the whenever you hear it, like on TV, it's on like every show, right? You know, every the little bits of it on even on Friends I was watching the other day. And when that comes on, bingo! You're back in the 70s. You know, he was just a man. I may be biased, but I have a lot of more respect for him than a lot of historians have. I mean, I really think he was the guy who introduced funk for what it is, because he really transferred it from its own little bailiwick to the mainstream. He stole an amazing amount of records,
Yeah.
without having except for Shaft and the records, the ones he wrote with Dave Porter at Stax, except for those. He never really had like top 10 entries, but his albums were like 6 gold albums.
Yep.
And they just had such amazing influence that I think you're right. I mean, people would do themselves a lot of good, especially the record artists of today, who sample him all the time.
Yep.
Without giving him any, monetary benefits, if they knew more about him. And that's why I wrote it.
Wow.
That's why I wrote the book.
Where I was first introduced to Isaac Hayes was the early days of FM radio, and at midnight they would just drop the needle on an album, and they would always play Isaac Hayes, and that's how I got to know who Isaac Hayes was beyond the hits, and we got the deeper cuts and stuff. That's what's missing are those days of radio where we could get the full album.
Yeah, you know why? Because he was the first R&B artist to have that concept album kind of, attitude, like, which in the 70s took over radio, the FM radio, the concept album and the free form and the long records. I mean, he was making records that were like 19 minutes and 12 minutes, and that you couldn't find that on James Brown. And James Brown would do a 2-minute song and get off. It was great. And, he was the father of funk, but he really didn't transfer it to the mainstream of white culture the way Isaac did. I mean, his audience was just as much white as black.
Yep.
Which is really amazing considering coming out of the 60s, he really set the table for Barry White and, the Gap Band and Earth, Wind and Fire and, groups like that who went on, who did like free form, long form kind of, music. And it just erupted out of his head. It wasn't any kind of directive. The story of Stax, the guy who was running it, Al Bell, the executive vice president, but really the guy who was running the show there, said to him one day, why don't you just do an album? We're kind of suffering. Otis Redding had just died in the plane crash.
Mm-hmm.
And why don't you go in and do an album? And he was in the studio with Duck John and Steve Cropper that night, with nothing on paper, no plan or anything. He covered B.B. King, he did some blues stuff. And he was drunk, so drunk he didn't even remember doing it.
Oh, my God.
Duck Dunn used to talk about, how drunk they were that night, that they didn't even remember it the next day. They said, well, did we do something last night in the studio? And it was introducing Isaac Hayes. And the album, was a flop. But if you go back and listen to that, that's the real beginning of the funk that took over the 70s, because he was just totally free. He was just like, he was like on stage without any kind of set list, just doing what he wanted to do. And it's amazing listening to. It's amazing listening to any Isaac Hayes album, because it's sort of like Pink Floyd. You have to listen to it from start to finish to get it. You can't really like just say, well, I'm going to listen to what by the time I get to Phoenix, this 19-minute version of that. Well, you can't, because that just segues into the next one, and then into the next one. They're free form, and they all came out of his brain as thoughts that followed each other. So you have to follow them on record. You have to follow them when you listen to them from start to finish. I think someone wrote a review once, I think in the New York Times, who said once a year, listen to an Isaac Hayes album. Just pick one. Just pick one. I mean, he had like 20 studio albums, so you got a lot to choose from. But if you pick one like from the early 70s, like Black Moses or Hot Buttered Soul, just listen it from start to finish, and you'll come away a different person.
Yep.
And that was absolutely correct. You come away with a new understanding of what soul actually meant. It wasn't just a 2.5-minute James Brown song. Yeah. It was an hour-long Isaac Hayes album.
Yeah,
it's true. It's true. You listen to him, and it's like Pink Floyd, who ended a song like flat out, right? And you say, why that song end in a flat out stop before you even knew it was there? Well, it was because the next track picked up from that.
Yep.
It was an emotional feel. It was a tug. It was a pull that was restored with the next cut.
Yeah.
But try to convince people in the early 70s to do that, and they would say, what are you talking about?
Right.
Yet his albums, he had 6 gold albums. So they were doing it. They were doing it without being told to do it. They were doing it.
Yeah. I had a program director tell me one time, he says, you got to really pay attention to Isaac Hayes in the way that in his own way, he's reinvented a new wave of jazz. And he says, I guarantee jazz will follow him. And when you listen to a lot of today's modern day funk jazz, I'm telling you, there has to be the seeds of Isaac Hayes in there.
He was number 1 on the Billboard jazz album list a few times.
See?
I think Shaft was like on every list. Shaft was black, white, green. It doesn't matter. But he was a jazz master. He produced a Donald Byrd album, Lovebird, which it's considered Bird's best album. He did that sort of just off the cuff, when he was floating around, and he did that a lot. Isaac, let's face it, he wasn't the most responsible person in the world, as the book goes into. But he would always come back to music, even if it was just for chocolate salty balls on South Park. He'd come back and he'd do something, and it would ignite a fuse somewhere, for somebody listening to it. Because he just had that. He had that thing, and you could hear it. I mean, if you go back to Stax, and he was on several Otis Redding, Otis Redding cuts, when he was just like a stringer, basically. He wasn't even on payroll there. And then, when he did Soul Man with Dave Porter, I in the book, I really made the point that really was when soul grew up, because it reflected a political bent. It had the usual, love battleground kind of theme,
right?
Self-improvement. People didn't understand what that Woodstock line meant, and they thought that he and Porter had a premonition of Woodstock 2 years before Woodstock happened, But what he was talking about was a school in Memphis that was prohibited to black kids, and one of the themes of Soul Man was that you're gonna grow up as a soul man, and you're gonna be proud of it, and they're gonna be proud of you. And in time, black kids were accepted into Woodstock in Memphis. So that's like a little hidden clue about what he and Porter were trying to do. In the 60s, it wasn't as obvious as in the 70s. You couldn't get overly political. You couldn't get overly sexual, But when Sam and Dave sang, man, it was you didn't need any clues about what it was about.
Yep.
They were after they were after it from the start. But it also applied to so many different aspects of life back then. I mean, Memphis wasn't. They were like 2 blocks from where Martin Luther King was killed.
Oh my God.
He was going to meet with Isaac Hayes that day in 1968, along with other Stax performers, and actually, Ike would have been there when he was shot, but he couldn't get a car, so he had to wait till his wife at the time gave him the car that they had, so he could drive over there to the Lorraine Motel, which is where Stax kept an office, by the way, so that their writers could get away from the building, the main building, the theater there on Beale Street, or actually Macklemore Street, and go over to the Lorraine and combine on a song. He was gonna meet Martin Luther King that day. By the time he got there, he was dead. And, he went into Isaac went into a 2-year funk after that. He couldn't write. That's how affected he was by it. But Memphis was like where everything was back then, and it just fell into such disrepair and poverty and horribleness. That whole theater was destroyed. I mean, it seemed like black music itself was being dismantled at a time, like in the 80s or so. Of course, it's been restored since then, and that old theater has been rebuilt from scratch and turned into the Stax Museum. And guess what's the main attraction of the Stax Museum?
Probably
Isaac Hayes is on El Dorado, which in itself was symbolic of so much of what was going on in soul, because there was a lot of backlash against it too. There were songs written that condemned Cadillacs by name, as a false prophet, false god of profit, and Isaac, went bankrupt, lost everything, as did Stax. The story goes up and down in the book. It's like an undulation. It's like an odyssey. There's triumph, there's tragedy, there's genius and stupidity, all at the same time. Wow. And that actually is a marker of what the soul struggle was about in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. Very interesting how the soul music attaches itself to the culture. It does in so many ways. I mean, soul music was so integral to the civil rights movement. I've written other books, and I pointed out that when Martin Luther King had his March on Washington, the #1 song in the country was Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder's, the jazz soul of Stevie Wonder is his album, and his Fingertips, Part 1.
Wow.
That was #1 in the country, and they played it over and over again at the March on Washington. And it's not accidental. I mean, you can't look at Curtis Mayfield's music and say it had no effect on the civil rights struggle, because that's where it really became, it got into the soul of people. What they were fighting for. It was expressed by black artists on record, who at the time couldn't even get a Grammy nomination other than in the R&B category.
Right.
They were subjugated, but the music came through loud and clear for years.
Do you find yourself being an archaeologist of music, or do you find yourself being the teacher? Because everything that you're holding is something that we've got to push into the next generation. But it's like, that's what I loved about being in this book. I felt like that I was sitting with you, and I wasn't reading a book. I was just with you.
Yeah, I feel like an archaeologist.
Do you?
Because when I do a book, I don't just rely on, Wikipedia to tell me that was #1, on the R&B list, #8 on the adult contemporary list. I go back to if they exist, and a lot of times they do, but you gotta put a lot of work in to find them. The original sheets, the session sheets, which is why I found out that Isaac Hayes was not on some of Otis Redding's earliest records, as has been written by a lot of prominent authors, which people I respect. But he was not on Security. His first session for Otis was on a song called "Yank Me Doodle." Okay, it doesn't sound the same as Security or Come to Me.
Yeah.
But he
Right.
was, but he was on that, and then after that he was on Respect, okay, and a change is going to come, and I've been loving you too long, and the cover of Satisfaction. He was moving on up, but I had to go to the sheets to find this, because they would tell you if they kept their records. A lot of companies didn't keep their records,
Mm.
but Stax did, and fortunately, because they were part of the Atlantic Records Combine, and they were part of that corporate thing, and so a lot of their sessions were charted, and that's where you become an archaeologist. You have to dig out the songs these guys were on. You have to the dates that they were on. So that's a really important part of being a researcher. And I love the research aspect of music,
Yep.
because so much of it is wrong and what's been written through the year. I've done 35 books. I'm not blowing my horn. I'm just saying I've done that many books, which means I've got a certain template I follow. And a lot of those books are about music, obviously. Most of them probably by now are about music. And I got to set the record straight, man.
Yeah.
If I'm doing a biography of Otis Redding, which I did, I got to find out exactly when he recorded these
Yes.
great songs. I'm not going to just sit back and rely on Wikipedia to tell me, oh well, he performed in the mid '60s on this session and that session. It's not true most of the time. So you got to dig that out. But then you take that archaeologist's role and you apply it to the teacher role.
Yes.
Because about music is not really well founded. It's not really, people don't realize how important music has been to pop culture in America. It's been everything. We've been guided every step of the way by music, which is what makes music today so tragic to me. I don't like being guided by the rap music that I hear. And by the way, neither would Otis Redding, neither would Isaac Hayes, and neither would Bill Withers.
Mm-hmm.
They never could really, even though they've been sampled thousands of times, they never were given the proper credit for it. They never made any money off of it. And they never could really understand it. They're like me, I'm an old timer. And those guys, they couldn't understand what rap music was, what hip hop was, but yet they contributed so much to it.
Right.
They contributed so much to it just by the music that they promulgated. It was copied, line for line, note for note, later on in different musical forms, which they could never understand, but they were responsible for it. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really opened up the door for that was when Blurred Lines from Robin Thicke was taken to court, and that was a Marvin Gaye song. I knew it was a Marvin Gaye song the first time that I ever heard it, and it was like, this can't be real. And so I mean, but they're finally breaking down, and families are stepping forward saying, no, that's my dad's song, or that's my mom's song.
That was such a blatant ripoff. I couldn't believe anybody would actually try to debate that.
Yeah,
it was the song. But you hear it. But you know what? You hear it in Led Zeppelin.
Yep.
Back to Muddy Waters and I mean, it just direct copies. And of course, Jimmy Page will say, well, of course we had that. They influenced us, and it was a tribute to them. But no, it was a tribute. You didn't give any credit. You didn't give any royalties to them for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that happened with Isaac Hayes a lot. Even though he was very wealthy before he went broke, he was very wealthy and, didn't need that kind of aid from others, and Bill Withers, but they were pissed off totally by not getting it.
Yep.
Because they were the ones who originated a lot of that music. And to hear it, they'd hear it almost line for line, in songs, and they couldn't believe that they had no power to do anything about it.
Wow.
Wow. So it was only later on in their lives when music changed and became so corporate that they were able to win back. This happened with Isaac Hayes and Bill Withers. They were able to win back a lot of those royalties that were kept from them. They were also victimized by their own labels. You know that, right?
Yep,
I mean, Stax was screwed royally by Atlantic Records and then they were screwed by CBS Records, and and the IRS took so much of Stax's money and licensing that they were able to sell off Isaac Hayes' royalty to whatever bidder came in and bought it.
Yep.
It's horrible, and a lot of those abuses are still not rectified. But fortunately, Isaac and Bill Withers and many others were able to win back a lot of their royalty rights and licensing rights, but only because they were so popular. Yep. The ones who were never as popular and were stolen from died without ever making much of any kind of profit from their music. Wow. That's the original sin of rock and roll. So many of these black artists from the 50s. And I did a book on Little Richard and then applied to him, one of the biggest names in music the world has ever known. Yeah. Didn't get his royalties back until Michael Jackson bought the catalog, the Beatles catalog, and saw that Little Richard was included in some of his records were included in that, and paid off Little Richard like $5 million or something.
Wow. Wow.
He did that late in Little Richard's life, but it was appreciated because even Little Richard had to suffer. One of the world's biggest artists of all time had to suffer like that, and stuff like that. You still have court cases like that going on, where these artists are trying to get their due, but they don't. Some of them never do, and that's the tragedy.
Mark, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. I love talking with you, sir.
Well, there's so much more to talk about. It's unbelievable. That's what I was saying before. But yeah, anytime, give me a buzz.
I will, man. And I can't thank you enough for what you have done with music history and stuff like that. I mean, you are a brilliant first step of a brand new beginning for so many of these artists.
Is that right? I hope so.
I think so because you know what? Like I said, I can't put the book down, and because I'm learning things that I did not know, and I was that jock on the radio. There are many times I'm embarrassed because I didn't get the story right.
Well, that means I've done my job, so I appreciate it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay, sir?
Thank you.